Well, thank you very much, Stoyan. And if you wouldn't mind passing these out to everybody, I really appreciate that. I have no idea what he just said, but that's maybe for the best. I'm sure he was insulting me up and down in a language that I can't speak. But thank you guys very much all for coming. And Stoyan, thank you so much for having me here. It's a real honor and pleasure for me. I was actually in Bulgaria for another conference, and this one is a conference, a talk that I'm going to give to a friendly audience, which is always better. So I really appreciate you guys coming, and without further ado, I'll just get started. So my talk is entitled Freedom in Education and Homeschooling in Bulgaria. So before I start talking about that, first I want to make sure that we know what those terms mean. Not homeschooling in Bulgaria, we know what that means, but freedom and education. Not everybody uses those terms the same way. Believe it or not. You hear freedom all the time, at least in America, where I come from. Everyone's always talking about freedom. Not everyone fully understands what it means, and everyone wants to claim it for themselves. So what I mean when I say freedom, particularly with regard to education, of course, is political freedom, and it means the freedom to choose between options, between reasonable options, and to have a real choice between the options that you have. There are many places in the world, and that goes for America, that goes for Bulgaria, where that's not fully true. In fact, I don't think there's really anywhere in the world nowadays where it's 100% true. And education, of course. When we talk about freedom, we connect that with education. And the landscape for education is not one of freedom, oftentimes. Those two terms do not intersect with each other. Education is learning in terms of technical learning, in terms of physical education, learning about your body and health, and then, of course, psychological, or you might call it spiritual education. All those things are equally important. And it's not clear to me that there's anywhere in the world, really, that the entire system of education takes care adequately of all those things and is possible and attainable for everyone who wants to participate in it. So many people are left behind, and it's not their fault all the time. Of course, sometimes, people don't want real education, and that's their choice. But there are a lot of places in the world where even when you want it, you can't get it. Freedom is relevant to education because, well, let's just start. I love to start with the history. When we first start talking about the liberal arts, when people are learning a broad spectrum of topics in, ancient times, the ancient Roman Empire, the artes liberales were called liberal, not because everyone who studies is a liberal, right, a libertarian. It's because it was understood that if you wanted to learn the arts, then the arts would make you liberalis, they'd make you free. So from the very beginning, education has been seen as a preparation for freedom, being a free man, free woman, free person. So as those two are so deeply connected, what you have to understand is that when you are receiving an education, you are not just receiving the content of the education. You're not just learning the words that are in the book. You're also receiving the context. Where you learn, how you learn, who you learn from, and the laws even about learning in general are just as important as the things you learn: history, science, math, etc. And if the context of education is not free, then you're not training kids to be free people. By the way, I talk about education, and I should define it a little bit more narrowly too. I won't be talking about university education or that kind of thing. I'm talking about education that is formative, education that we should all have a stake in what it looks like. Because if the next generation comes up in an educational system that is not free, then they're going to grow up as people who do not understand and do not appreciate freedom in education and in other things for the rest of their lives. So, like I said, I like to start historically. And so if you look at the history of this country, there's actually, just like the rest of Europe, there's actually been a lot of homeschooling throughout history, throughout time. Homeschooling is not a modern movement that somebody just made up because we don't like the government and we want things to be different, so now we're going to homeschool. No. There's actually a book that I'm working on right now that there's so much historical evidence demonstrating that what we call homeschooling was the default for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. There were schools, of course, throughout European history, but that doesn't mean that schools have always been what we think of as schools, and it also doesn't mean that education has always considered going to school to be the default mode of education. Not every kid went to a physical school throughout all of history, right? Schools came from somewhere. The public school system was developed. In the 18th and 19th century, actually, the most common place for girls to be educated was at home. And female literacy during that time was at the highest point that it's ever been, at least in the English-speaking world, and in certain other European countries as well, like Germany. Even today, when female literacy is, of course, extremely high, they've still never equaled the point during the Victorian era. And, you know, just case in point, I don't know if you guys have ever heard, there's an English term that we use called a potboiler novel. It just means like a fiction that is cheap to buy, very common to read. It's not literary, upscale, high-class fiction. Well, why do they call it a potboiler novel? Because women were cooking at the pots, and while it's cooking, they've got their novel and they're sitting and reading it, right? Women were extremely well educated, and that's thanks to domestic education. That's thanks to home education, and learned lots of other things as well. It wasn't limited to just the topics that we typically study in school. So, you know, you have homeschooling in Europe long before the homeschooling movement, right? Which is what my organization, of course, focuses on. We look at laws in different countries. We look at opportunities and access. But the only reason we have to look at those things is because now the default is the opposite, right? The default is that things are going to be controlled from the top, everything's centralized. Now, there is actually a famous example of something very similar to homeschool in Bulgaria, too. And those are the Kilini Uchilisha, the cell schools, right? When you look at these are not necessarily parents keeping their kids home and teaching them subjects, although that, of course, happened since the 16th century, the same way that the cell schools happened. But these were actually what today we would refer to as homeschool co-ops. When we say co-op, it means cooperative, where many families would participate together and learn together. And often they would involve local parish priest or some other local expert who perhaps is better at certain subjects. And in America, you know, we do this all the time. I was educated in a homeschool co-op for several years. And it was an excellent experience, and I'll talk more about that closer to the end. But if you look at, my point is that if you look at the history of education, where does public school, where does government-controlled education come in? Where does it stop being the parent's job to decide, and when does it start being the government's job to decide? Different answers for different countries. You look at Germany, for example. Of course, as you guys perhaps know, homeschooling of any kind is illegal in Germany. School attendance is mandatory. And not only is it illegal, it's one of the most extreme cases of illegal education in that parents and children have been arrested, brutally and violently arrested. I know it's hard to believe. Maybe it's not hard to believe, but it's a tyrannical regime when it comes to education. We're talking SWAT team kicks down the door and drags the family away. I'm not joking. Like, this is like, you can read about it in the news. The family that was arrested is called the Wonderlic Family, and the kids were taken and held for several months. They've been fighting their case for years, and just recently the Court of Human Rights at the EU said that they do not have a right to do that. So they're still being denied, and they're thinking about, as several other families have, leaving Germany. But Germany was, believe it or not,
I think there was a German family that moved to Bulgaria because of that. I think there was something like that.
Generally, they'll flee to Austria because Austria, you know, they speak the same language and they have much more lax homeschool law, but some of them have fled to Russia. I didn't know they come to Bulgaria. I don't know.
I think there was one family that came.
No, it's not only one. This summer I met 3 families.
Wow.
They came to visit friends. Then they understood how, they can be free here.
Mm-hmm.
So they moved for 2 months.
Okay.
Other friends came. So for a year, 3 families are here in Bulgaria.
Well,
in a village.
They're better than me because then they learn Bulgarian, I guess, right? So good for them. But Germany was actually the place where the first public school system was created in Europe. And this was on the part of Protestant reformers who thought that, hey, if we have a public school system, then more people will get an education. So I think there was some good intentions with that. But you look at a place like Norway, for example. Their public school system was established in 1739. And what was interesting is that when it was established, it was explicitly established as an institution that technically had the same rights, 50-50 rights over education as the parents. It was seen as something that could override or at least combat parents who wanted to educate their children a certain way. It was enshrined in law that they had the right to tell parents what they could do with their kids' education. So that's a very disturbing development. If these are your values, or even if you are just a homeschooler that cares about homeschooling, that's a very disturbing development, in my opinion. So, is that for me?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. In Bulgaria, the first Bulgarian constitution and later developments in Bulgaria made school mandatory. At first it was 3 years, then 4 years. And school attendance, being mandatory is, I'm just going to say, school attendance being mandatory is not necessarily always a bad thing. Literacy levels go up, and I believe in education choice. I believe in education freedom, including the freedom not to get the same type of education as others. But if you're talking about the common good and a country wanting to raise the level of education, it's not always a bad thing for the government to require that kids go to school. But look what we have now in Bulgaria. You have, since 2017, I believe it was, a government tracking database to track student attendance. And that can only ever lead to, it's a tool of enforcement, right? So this is only a tool of surveillance and enforcement. So it goes from, hey, we want to make sure kids can read. We want to make sure kids can write, all the way to, if we see a kid, walking around with a parent, we're going to get them, we're writing you down in a list. So this is the way that tyranny always slowly evolves over, 100 years. But, as late as 1944, before the Soviet Union, there were still like 100,000 students every year getting an education from their parents and not from the schools. Even though school attendance was mandatory, there's still, according to a historian named Nigel Grant, there's still 100,000 Bulgarian kids every year staying home, learning the education that they needed for the type of life that it was expected that they would have, right? If your family is a family that works agriculturally, you don't necessarily need to learn advanced mathematics. So everything was customized by family based on parental decision, even as late as the Soviet Union. So here's the question that people will ask me. Does this country have education freedom? Does this country have legal homeschool? And it's not always an easy binary question. Even in Bulgaria, if you look at the school system, is it a free school system? Is not an easy question to answer. What level of education choice is there? So after the Soviet Union in the early 90s, you've got private schools, right? So countries with private schools, you might be able to easily answer, hey, people can choose to go to private schools. That's freedom in education. But that's not exactly the case, is it? Because what does the National Education Act of 1991 say about private schools? I wrote this down because I thought it was quite telling. Quote, whenever an individual citizen or organization opens a kindergarten or school, they shall be obliged to present to the Minister of National Education a program conforming to state educational requirements. Is that a private school?
Wow.
Not to me. I mean, maybe I'm just too American, right? But that doesn't sound like a private school to me. That's a government-run school that's being delegated to some people who basically are doing what the government tells them. They're outsourced, exactly. Now, in 2007, there was, of course, a decentralization reform from a teacher's strike, which offered so-called greater autonomy for all the schools in all the school districts, consolidated about 500 schools, and it was a reform. Teachers' wages went up. More teachers became better educated. You might say they have bachelor's degrees or master's degrees equivalents. So did the schools improve when power was decentralized, when more power was granted to local schools? Yes, it did, but only marginally is what I would say. Because first of all, that's subsidiarity, meaning you reduce the centralization of the authority, but it's not freedom, right? It gives the power to the institution, the school, not to the parents, which is where it belongs. And if you look at the effects of that reform, well, I wrote down some statistics that are not going to be unfamiliar to you guys. The EU has benchmarks for underperforming school systems. Bulgaria has had those benchmarks imposed on them for a long time and still isn't meeting them. It means you have to improve student outcomes by at least 50%. Still hasn't happened. If you guys are familiar with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, they give the PISA tests to ninth graders. Bulgaria has some of the worst, and I don't want to offend anybody, but Bulgaria has some of the worst PISA scores of all of the 72 countries that were tested. Bulgaria ranks 45th. 41% of Bulgarian ninth graders are functionally illiterate. They struggle to read and comprehend basic texts. And only 42% tested at their level in mathematics. So 58% didn't test at their level in mathematics. And if you're a Bulgarian ninth grader, you couldn't have done that. 42, 58, that would have been like, right. It's a joke. But what about Bulgaria's neighbors, right? Look at Greece. Okay, how did Bulgaria match up with Greece? I mean, I don't see any reason why Bulgaria shouldn't be at the same or higher than Greece. But Greece is 9 points higher in science. They're 13 points higher in math. They're 35 points higher in reading comprehension. And then here's the non-academic part, and this is very interesting. They have 25% lower truancy rates, like skipping school, and 8% lower incidences of bullying. So something's going wrong, right, with the school system. Something's going wrong. And no one should be forced to be compared with Estonia, because Estonia has somehow like magically amazing schools, but they're 88 points higher in science, 79 points higher in math, and 87 points higher in reading comprehension. So Bulgaria's schools are not the sort of place where I would say parents should be forced to send their children. There ought to be another option. I loved this quote from the former Deputy Minister of Education, Stamatov.
In Bulgaria?
Yeah. Stamatov says, blame Facebook. Yeah. And I'm not going to disagree with him, but he says, children are reading less and chatting more. And it's like, talk about passing the buck, right? That's on the President of the United States desk, there's this little sign that says the buck stops here, which means I don't get to pass the blame to someone else, right? Well, if only the Minister of Education, would allow the buck to stop with him. So in 2018, there's another form. There's something called the delegated budget reform, and this is just written into the budget. And essentially, instead of just giving local schools power over various decision-making processes and curriculum, now local school districts actually get the funds. So the central government doesn't determine both how money is spent and what sorts of things each school district should do. Now the school district is kind of given a check, and they are allowed to disperse that sort of in the way that you might say meets parents' needs. Good results of this, perhaps they are more responsive to local concerns, parental issues when people want to bring things up. Bad part of that, I don't think it's any secret to say, Bulgaria has problems with when money is given out to some local area, like it just kind of disappears, right? So, and again, No offense to anyone, but that's just, you know, these are things that we know. So this is a reform that it's not clear that that's going to have as good of an impact as is wanted. What about choice? What about options, right? When even your private schools are not private, choice is paramount. So homeschooling. There's an interesting aspect of this 2018 reform in that parents who participate in the individual form of education, which is an allowable, a legally recognized form of education, can actually receive those same funds. But individual education isn't the only way of doing homeschooling in Bulgaria, I'm sure, as many of you know. And some people would say that it's not homeschool. Yeah. So you could argue that it's not actually a homeschool. And I'll talk about that. Thank you. It came to prominence, this idea of homeschooling. This came to prominence, I would say, in 2013, when people actually around the world heard about at least people tuned into homeschooling in America, heard about a young student who won an IT Olympiad, right? And his competition was sort of capped off at the local level. He wasn't allowed to participate on the national level because he was a homeschool kid. His mom taught him what he learned. His grandpa taught him.
And grandpa too.
And, you know, when that's the only strike that is against him, that he wasn't formally enrolled in a government-run school, you know, it doesn't really make sense that he is therefore banned from competing. Did that give him an unfair advantage? So somehow he's a genius because he didn't learn in school? Well, what does that tell us, right? If that's the argument. But if that's not the argument, then what's the big deal, right? Why can't he compete? So this then kind of came into the public eye. And in 2016, of course, homeschool is legally recognized by the Bulgarian government. Individual education is legally recognized. I understand. Right.
You're essentially taking the lessons by yourself and then going to take the exams at the school.
Right.
But again,
So in the United States, there are people who are considered homeschoolers who are completely outside of the system of education. And then there are some who are similar to this, either cyber charter school students or technically enrolled in a public or private school. And they're all considered under the umbrella of homeschooling. And I do understand the argument that it's not technically homeschooling. But it's still an advance, I would say. It's still a step in the right direction to have in 2016 the government to legally recognize individual education. And actually, this is good because there'll be time for questions, and I think we should talk more about it, okay? Now, let me get back to the way that I started, okay? Because now we've talked a little bit about homeschooling, we've talked about educational freedom, and I want to bring up why I talked about freedom the way that I did. It's not that freedom means you can do whatever you want with education. I actually don't think that that's a good idea. No one's arguing that parents should be able to sell their kids, right? That's ridiculous. Or, you know, there are certain things that parents should not be able to do with their kids, right, in terms of education. But freedom means freedom to do something. It's the freedom to make a reasonable choice. And in the case of homeschooling, in most countries, that freedom is explicitly denied. Even in countries where homeschooling is legal, the reasonable choice to do it is denied either by law, various regulations, red tape, or it's denied by opportunity and access. Maybe it's just prohibitively expensive, so nobody does it. Or maybe there's a social stigma, and I'm not saying that there's an easy way to reform a social stigma against homeschooling, but these are things that prevent parents from keeping their kids home, teaching them, even if they're perfectly well qualified to do so. The classic example is, I think, in Italy, there is a big fight, and it's not a law yet, but there's a big fight over the question of whether if parents want to homeschool, if they should have to have an official teaching certificate. I mean, that's just a form of control, right? There's obviously parents who have, you know, PhD or some high level of education, perfectly capable of homeschooling their kids, but they can't because they don't have a teaching certificate. the awarding of such certificates are often controlled by either government bureaucracies or indirectly through teachers' unions. So are they incentivized to give these out? No. And teachers consider it an insult to them that parents could do the same thing that they can do without one, right? Which is just ridiculous. But in talking about the freedom to do something, I wanted to talk a little bit about my experience growing up in California in the United States, learning via homeschool, and the various types of school that I was in, and then my own experience teaching my own daughter. I have two daughters. One of them is too young to start school, but one of them we've already been teaching. So I want to talk a little bit about that, just share my experiences with you guys, and then, of course, I also want to hear from you. I want to know what you think about all this, and I want to hear from your experiences as well. So for me, I started homeschool at the age of 3, which is a weird time to start school, but my parents were very insistent that a 3-year-old should start learning. So we had 3 posters on my wall when I was a kid. We had the alphabet with ABC, A through Z, with numbers, and then the second poster was all the moves of all the pieces in chess. My dad is really into chess, so he wants me to learn. And then the third one was the Greek and Hebrew alphabet, because a 3-year-old, should be learning that, and that's very important. So you can just kind of see from that example, like how insistent my parents were in teaching me in this way, and it actually worked. I mean, as a 3 and 4-year-old, I learned all this stuff by memorization, and it was a little bit intense. They made me work hard as a little kid, but I actually remember those days. I have sort of fleeting memories of those days as being extremely enjoyable. It was, and it continued for another 6 years. Every morning I would wake up, and by the time I had learned how to read, I would go to the kitchen table, and since the night before, my mom would have put a stack of books and a list of page numbers that I was supposed to complete for that day. And the only time that I had a teacher was when I got to a part in the book that I didn't understand. Then I would go get mom, and mom would come and explain it to me. And if necessary, she would give me like a full discussion, explanation, not really a lecture, but, sort of one-on-one attention. And same for my brother and same for my sister. So we would all kind of sit at the table. And if we wanted to, we could wake up way early in the morning before breakfast and start working. And then we could be done by noon. And then we were out, free to explore the woods behind our house and all that sort of thing. So this is worlds apart from what most people tell me was their formative educational experience, which was, they're a little kid, they're 3, they're 4, they're having fun. Then they turn 5 and they get put in school, and it's glamorous for a few months because you're meeting all these new people and stuff. But after a while, you develop an attitude that is completely, you might just say, on the railroad tracks. You're not a car anymore, you're a train, right? So you get, some people call it a factory system, but there are, of course, schools that try to avoid that. There are things like Montessori schools where there's a lot of freedom that's allowed. So I wouldn't go so far as to say every school is a factory, but many of them are. And so I was fortunate enough to benefit from this. After I entered the 6th grade, starting in the 6th grade, I was placed in something called a homeschool co-op, which I mentioned before, which is essentially 20 to 30 families in various years. They all bring their kids to a central location, honestly, kind of something like this, where there's some office space for paperwork to get done, and then there's like an open area where we could sit in chairs and learn. We could have, outdoor time. We could have arts and crafts. This actually would have made a great homeschool spot, I think, homeschool co-op spot. And that was wonderful too, because it took the system that I was already used to, and it added in co-learners, which, by the way, if you're a homeschooler, it's hard to get co-learners for your kids. It's easy to get friends, I think. You can find friends for your kids anywhere, the park. But it's not always easy to get co-learners. Something beyond your siblings, where these are people that you're learning with, and they're competing with you, and they're propelling you onward to learn better. I'm not going to say it's necessary. Of course, a kid can get an education by his or herself, but having a co-learner next to me actually was a real benefit to me. It really pushed me to be better. And being in the co-op setup didn't kill my love of learning. Being with other kids didn't intimidate me. It was actually a really good situation. So I'm a big proponent of co-op homeschooling for that reason. Then I went into what we call a brick and mortar school, like a normal high school. And again, I did not lose my love of learning, which I'm grateful that that's the case. But I learned a lot of other things in that school. Besides the things that I was supposed to be learning, people trained me very well to commit crimes. I learned how to steal from people's lockers. You know, I learned how to beat people up. And it was sort of, you know, that situation was very similar, I think, to like being in county jail, because you just are kind of shepherded from room to room. And most of what you learn is the ability to like survive and defend yourself in a pack of fellow 14, 15, 16-year-olds who would like nothing more than to punch you in the face and take your stuff. So it's a very like Darwinian environment. And, you know, I'm not complaining about it. I'm just saying that that's the difference. And so I was able to see, you know, all three models, and I have my own opinion about which was best. But I think, you know, each one is appropriate in certain situations. And that's why I believe, and I'm a strong proponent of universal choice. You know, anyone that wants to pick for their own child should be able to. But I also think that education is not just the choice of the family, but I think it's also the natural role of the family. So, and the parents and the siblings, but the parents particularly, even when you're not homeschooling, for parents who are not homeschooling, or even when only one parent can homeschool full time, which is, I would say, for most who homeschool, that's the case, right? I mean, same for me and my daughter. My wife, of course, is the one that takes on most of it. But even in that situation, education is something that I think parents have to participate in. And even people who are not believers in homeschool, they don't think homeschooling is good at all. Even they will say, hey, if the parents are not involved, the teacher's job is 100 times harder. So that's at least one thing that we can all agree on. And not just we can all, but everyone should be able to agree on, just scientifically, that this is something that's extremely important. But that's why homeschool is so great. Parents are involved. You're in an environment of learning. Home is, because the parents are there, home is an environment of learning. Discipline is not something that is imposed forcefully at home as strongly as it would be in an institutional school. Institutional school, you are sort of like a customer, you might say an inmate, and the requirements are imposed directly from above. There's no relationship between the learner and the teacher most of the time, and there's especially no relationship between the learner and the person in charge, the administrator. So of course, discipline has to be enforced from above, especially when students like me turn up and they're 13 and 14 and they're committing crimes. But in general, what is the state of homeschooling? What is the benefit of homeschooling to society? Well, if homeschool is an option, and if freedom in general is an option, the society improves automatically, because parents with options are more satisfied with the education system, provably more satisfied than parents who don't have options. Parents who care about their kids' education, but hey, and where we live, there's only one school, and it's the only one, and you know, we don't get a choice, and we can't homeschool. That's a really terrible situation, I would say, for a parent to be in, and no one wants to be in that situation. One other note that I'll make about learning from my own experience in homeschool is that when I was being homeschooled in California, I noticed something about the law and its relationship with homeschool. And that is, when we were homeschooling just as a family, and we didn't really know anything about a homeschool community, which I've found to be the case with so many parents across Europe that are homeschooling. Since homeschool is kind of new, there's not really like a tradition of it necessarily, or a community. Not everywhere is like Bulgaria. Like Bulgaria, I think, has in various years between 2016 and now, you know, over 10,000, between 10 and 20,000 students who at least are part of the individual education system. So they're outside of the brick and mortar school. that's not the case in even places where it's legal. Places like Italy has less than 1,000. And Spain, in Spain, it's a lot less legal, but it's very small. So it's really hard to operate that way. And in California, when I was being educated as a homeschooler, it was next to impossible until we met up with others who did the same thing. They told us about the law. They told us, here's how to move in the system and make sure that you are following all of the, red tape, stay under the radar, and here's some resources to get you started. So that's one thing that I think is really important for homeschoolers in Europe, is to get them connected and to help them figure out, how to detangle the red tape. One way that can be done, for example, is let's say you don't want to participate in the school system at all. You don't like the individual form of education, which is 100% understandable, and you want to be an independent homeschooler. You want to just have your kids at home and teach them as it should be. Well, you don't have to enroll in, a Bulgarian school. You can actually achieve or obtain a diploma other ways. You can get a diploma for homeschool from America through online virtual school. And sometimes it doesn't even have to be, depending on where you get it, it doesn't even have to be registered and completed through this full curriculum system of that school. You can obtain a diploma simply by recognition through an American school. And these are options. So let me talk about Sophia, not the city, my daughter, whose name is Sophia. She is turning 4 early next year. And we have now been homeschooling her for the briefest of time, about 6 months. And we've been very purposeful about it, but we've also, of course, since she's so young, sort of opened it up to like, what does she enjoy? And, what sorts of things is she interested in? So my wife, first of all, I have to be very clear about one thing, is that this is not something that you can just snap your fingers and it's the easiest thing in the world, at least not for us. Even just teaching one kid who's that young, it's still a huge sacrifice. Every day for at least 6 hours, Mary, my wife, has to sit down with Sophia and go through these lessons with her. And a 3-year-old wants to do lots of things, and they do lots of things, but it's a huge sacrifice to devote that much attention and that much energy to getting this done. And those of you who homeschool know this, and I'm eternally grateful to my own mom for doing this for me when I was a kid. But it's a huge sacrifice. But it's also not a sacrifice in the sense that a lot of the things that Mary would be doing anyway, she now does with Sophia, and this is homeschool. They treat every activity like education. So if Mary's baking bread, Sophia's learning how to measure flour, and she's learning about time and the existence of time and how to measure it with a timer, and how you do this all with the oven and the ingredients. They go around town, collecting seeds and other types of plants. They learn what the plant is called. They take the seed from it. They bring it home. They help it germinate. And then Sophia learns like, oh, this is how the process works. She's learning about photosynthesis, right? She's learning about plant biology and categorizations and stuff like that. And it's just fun. She's just having fun. But instead of having fun like in front of the TV, she's having fun out in nature and learning. Of course, they do their trips to historical buildings and museums and zoos and art galleries. And then Sophia will come home and do art on her own. She works with clay. She does painting and drawing and other types of art. For example, she loves to sing and listen to a song and try to sing it back. And as every little girl does, at least that I've seen, she loves ballet. So she's constantly watching ballerinas, and then she does an amazing job trying to imitate them in the most hilarious ways. But that's not the extent of their homeschool, right? They do a lot of really rigorous stuff as well. So every day they sit down and they do letters, not Hebrew and Greek letters, but I doubt Sophia would be up to the task anyway. But she's got the whole alphabet. She's learning the whole alphabet. She's doing addition and subtraction now with these little like math toys where you like have 10 little rubber balls and you take 3 away, how many are left, and you count them. And she's learning, right? She's learning how to do this. it takes so much time and so much repetition. She memorized the Lord's Prayer recently. Thought that was a huge coup for her. And I would ascribe, I mean, I look around at students her age who are in preschool, people that she plays with at the park and stuff. And it strikes me that so many of these other kids are, of course, they're 100% capable of what Sophia can do, but the school doesn't really push them in the same way. I think a lot of the schools are seen as a place to put your kids so while you're doing something else. And it kind of defeats the whole purpose of getting an education. And I mean, I would guess that it's probably pretty disheartening for the kids too, because it's, oh, am I here to learn or am I just here because you need to go to work, right? So I think that even though that's necessary and that's important in certain cases, it's just clear that homeschooling is not just a thing that people do because they like it or it's a hobby. It's actually an elite education. It's an opportunity that you can offer to your kids. And it shouldn't be seen as this like, oh, what a social pariah. He homeschools his kids because he hates, you know, the government school system, or he is like, has this different ideology or philosophy and he wants to just be cooler than us. No, it's actually the same reason why some, you know, rich person, at least in America, this is every rich person will put their kids in boarding school, right? Oh, that's the real education. $50,000 a year for them to go to school. I'm not even kidding. If they can do that and they get this outcome, and a parent who doesn't have $50,000 a year can do homeschooling and they get this outcome, why on earth would you not do that, right? It's almost obvious. I'll tell you another anecdote from my wife. So she's creating a list of all of the kids' books that she thinks are worthy of reading. And she's trashing the ones that are not. So people will even like give us a book and she'll be like, no, you know. But someone tried to give us a book recently for a gift. Like, oh, this will be so funny. And the book is called I Need a New Butt. Oh. And like, it's like some kid like thinks that his butt is bad and he needs a new butt. And we both looked at this and we're like, this is supposed to be like learning. She's learning stuff. Like, no, this is just trash. So we just threw it in the trash. But Mary has these like amazing books that she finds. I don't know where she finds them, but she has this one book that is like a child version, an illustrated children's version of the epic poems of Edmund Spenser, like the Fairy Queen. And so she's reading these books about the Fairy Queen and St. George, and she's like reading this fairy tale basically. And the art is wonderful, and she flips through it. And she started to learn it, so when you turn the page, she can almost like start to say, without being able to read, of course, the words that are on the page. But we had this moment recently where we were visiting this cathedral in Western Pennsylvania that's very old, has these beautiful stained glass windows. And one of the stained glass windows has an image of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so he's like rising up from the tomb, and he has this banner with like white background and a red cross on it. And Sophia is like looking around the church, and you know, she's a little kid, so she of course doesn't like know what to make of all the colors and stuff. But she sees that and she goes, you know, that's the same banner that the Red Cross Knight has in my stories. And like when we heard her say that, we're like, she's cultured. Like she has an art history degree already. Like she's making these connections. So like just in little stories like that, you can already see the benefit. And she hasn't even turned 4. So when I say like homeschooling is actually an opportunity, it's an elite form of education, that's what I'm talking about. So how much time would you say I have? 5 minutes? Yeah. So I just want to end by hammering that point home on a non-anecdotal level. In Europe, we don't have necessarily like great statistics for countries that have homeschooling, for outcomes of homeschooling, but in America we do. And homeschooling has been a thing for maybe like 30 years, at least in the modern sense, the movement homeschooling sense, for about 30 years. And there have been tons of scientific studies done during that time, whatever we think about scientific studies. But there is at least demonstrable evidence that homeschooling benefits students on multiple levels. So I found some statistics from the website of the National Home Education Research Institute. Home educated students, all various types of homeschool, unschool, cyber charter school, essentially just a student not going to school, student staying home, and the broadest possible meaning of homeschool. These home educated students score between 15 and 30 percentage points higher on standard achievement tests. Percentage points. That's massive. They are above average socially, emotionally, and psychologically in categories like peer interaction. That's a surprise. Homeschooled, better at peer interaction. Introspection, like sort of knowing yourself, knowing your limits, that kind of thing. Leadership skills, family cohesion. They perform more community service, and they have higher scores from psychologists on self-esteem. That's amazing. On all these categories, staying home and learning in that environment puts you ahead of students who go to physical school and learn in that environment. And the 15 to 30 in test scores is depending on which form you're talking about. Like, is it a screen learning? And for the physical school as well, is it a public school? Is it a charter school? Is it a private school? These students also attend college at higher rates, which you expect because of those test scores. And they also vote more than students who went to school more often, which is very interesting because one of the main arguments you hear is that homeschooling is this system that isolates, right? It removes students from the society. And I would go so far as to say, especially in the EU, that this is a primary concern for governments, right? That people are going to be outside the system. They're going to be doing their own thing. They're not going to be learning the way that the government wants them to learn as a civic sort of act, becoming a citizen, right? Well, homeschoolers in the US are becoming citizens to a greater degree than children in schools. So for all those reasons, I don't want to put it so strongly, but maybe I would say that it's a no-brainer. Maybe not for every parent to be a homeschooler and to homeschool their kids, but at least for every country to open this as an accessible and popular and, of course, legal way to educate kids. Thanks.
So I'll take up my role as a moderator now. And if you have questions, just raise your hand and I'll give you the floor. But before you have that opportunity, I have a couple of questions myself.
Yeah.
So, I'll abuse this position now. First, I'll abuse my position. This position of privilege and power. So the first question I want to raise is it comes from personal experience. It's something that you mentioned in your talk, and it concerns stigma, social stigma. And I've noticed, please, correct me if you have different experiences. But I've noticed in Bulgaria that's an issue. Homeschooling your child could bring that the ghost of social stigma. People say, well, he's a religious fundamentalist, or these parents, their child is totally outside of
society,
of the group, and their child cannot communicate with its peers normally. So that's why they're taking it out of the system. So do you think there are good ways to counter this? What is your experience or something you've seen elsewhere? Because I think that's an issue. I've had this conversation. My sister is now pregnant, and with my mother, we had this debate, and they're very stuck on the old system.
Okay.
And I'm trying to bring all the good arguments, some of those that you presented today, but they're stuck in this. And one of the main issues is that they cannot bridge this stigma thing, I think, in their minds, because I think they understand the system is very, very, very bad in Bulgaria. My sister and me, we went to the same school. It's over there. It's the Sophia Mathematics High School, which Semege, you know about it. And it's, in my opinion, was the best school, although it's considered to be one of the best schools in Sofia. And my sister knows this. She was there as well. but still there's this bridge she has to cross to get to the place where she says, okay, we're going to do homeschooling.
Absolutely. So this is one of the most common questions, I would say, that's asked to homeschoolers in America, period. And we usually refer to it as socialization.
Yeah.
It's the socialization question. How will your students be socialized? How will your kids be socialized? And there are two ways that are the best ways, in my opinion, to go about answering it. The first way is the statistics. Look at any study of the socialization of homeschooled kids versus public school versus private school, and every single one, maybe with like one or two outliers, puts homeschool students ahead. So they put them ahead, for example, in qualitative behavioral studies, where you find that a 10-year-old is playing better with his fellow 10-year-olds or with any other kind of group of kid than a 10-year-old, a homeschool 10-year-old who's than a 10-year-old who's in public school. You can just go and research. It's very easy to find these studies in America, and even in a couple of other countries like South Africa, for example, and England. They find the same thing. So statistically speaking, what would not be intuitive is the case. It's just true that statistically speaking, homeschoolers actually rank higher. Now, let's say we don't believe that, because there are all kinds of studies that I don't believe. And also, let's say that just doesn't make sense. Like, it doesn't fit with what you're thinking and the way that you think about child development. It doesn't make sense that a kid is by himself learning as opposed to with other kids, and he's somehow better at being with other kids. It makes no sense. But actually, it does make perfect sense. If you think back to when you were a student, or if you watch your own students and you hear what they have to say about being in school, the experience that you get in school is not an authentic socialized environment. You are placed, first of all, in a group with people your own age exclusively. So you only learn how to interact with people your own age exclusively. And then second of all, you're kind of thrown into, like I referred to it before, a like Darwinian system. And this is especially true, I think, for boys, but there's a unique issues that girls have in school as well. And the social stigma, I think, arises from the simple fact that it's uncommon, not the fact that when you look at a homeschooler, there's something weird or off about them. People who know families that have kids who are homeschooled, vast majority of them will say, oh, wow, what well-behaved kids you had, or wow, your kids seem like very friendly. They came right up and talked to me. And I think that's because they get these alternate forms of socialization that are more well-rounded. Now, when it comes to, if I homeschool my kids, everyone's going to look at me really weird. I mean, that's just true. You can't deny that that's true. But like, what if I said, I'm a Jew. If I moved to America in 1910, everyone will look at me weird. Like, yeah, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't have Jews in America, right? Like, that's my point. Is like, just because at one time something is considered weird in the 90s when we were homeschooling, we would be out at the mall or something with my mom in the middle of the school day, and everyone would be like, hey, well, shouldn't they be in school? And like, that's difficult for a parent. But on the other hand, now in America, 1.7 million kids, everyone knows someone who homeschools. It's not weird anymore. It's no more weird than, oh yeah, I have a Jewish friend. Like, you know what I mean? That's the same thing. So,
well, to build on that, again, it's the same type of question. It's the same line of questioning.
Yeah.
So what you mentioned that and with your own personal experience, and we've seen that as well. That when you go to school, you get this opportunity to, like in prison, you learn how to
fend for yourself.
The environment, fend for yourself.
Yep.
You get streetwise in some sense, and if you look at the homeschool children, yes, they want to communicate with you. They're grown up in ways that children who go to government schools are not. But they kind of look meeker, right?
Yep.
They're not
more naive.
Yep. They're friendlier, but that the world might not be that friendly.
That's right.
So how would you go about dealing with this? You don't have the streetwise. You didn't have the opportunity to, if you're a boy, to fight some of your classmates, to deal with bullies, to deal with this, really prison-like environment, especially if you're in a worse school than, if it's not a elite school. Even there, you get bullying, but it's another form.
Totally understand, and that's a great question. So the first thing I would say is just let's conceptualize this. What are we talking about? And I'm going to use Aristotle's concept of the golden mean, right, between two extremes. So there is an extreme of naivete and meekness where if a student grows up their entire life and they never encounter, that social difficulty, they never encounter conflict, obviously they're not going to make it very far in the so-called real world without those kinds of skills. And I'm, of course, grateful that at some point along the line, someone did try to beat me up. I think that's great. But actually, they didn't try. They really did beat me up. I lost many times. But the other extreme, I would say, is destroying a child's innocence and destroying a child's naivete. Children are children. They're not little miniature adults, and we don't actually have to prepare them for the so-called real world at age 7, which is when, most kids, I mean, if you look at statistics, for example, it's on kids in the room, but SEXUAL, assault, right? I don't know. Did everyone get what I'm talking about? Yeah. So like RAPE in school, okay? I'm just, because there's kids in the room, but, that's really problematic at age 7, 8, 9, which is when it's starting to happen now in public schools in the inner city. So there's two extremes, is my point, right? There's the extreme of extreme naivete, and then there's the extreme of, wow, that was real life way too fast. And I would say that if you're a homeschooler, and there's a lot of reasons to be a homeschooler, and you want to make sure that you don't end up with like starry-eyed, naive kids, one of the ways that I've seen has been really effective, for example, if you have boys, to enroll them in boys club. Like we have Boy Scouts, we have other organizations like that, and they're centered around doing something really good together as a group, but they're also 12 to 16-year-old boys, and all the same stuff happens among them, but it's sort of in an environment that's like focused on something better than just being in a prison all day. So it's not like a petri dish, for them to experiment on. Other options, for example, like when I talked about being in the homeschool co-op, I think that was a similar situation. I actually encountered a relative amount of conflict that I didn't ever have with just my siblings. So I think it was, there was value to that. There are like halfway options that you can do to offer those experiences to your kid without just throwing them in the deep end of the pool and telling them to swim.
Okay. So I have other questions, but I want to open the floor. Really open the floor because we can keep this conversation.
Dictator over here.
So anyone with questions, please raise your hand. Professor, you go first.
How about John Taylor Gatto's The Underground History of American Education?
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar?
I know Gatto. I've never read that book.
Maybe you can just spend a few, if you're familiar, to explain.
No, yeah, go ahead.
No. Do you believe that the government intentionally, maliciously, with evil intent, tries to keep children back from developing? Because I'm like in the education system, I get to see it once I get to understand what the intent is. Because there is a correlation, back to your presentation, between totalitarian systems or fascist like Greece and Spain and Italy, and respectively compulsory education.
Absolutely. So first of all, the history of that is very clear. Totalitarian regimes, yes. In America, you have a situation in which no one would call, well, most people would not call America a totalitarian regime.
It's getting there. It's moving faster.
But let me conceptualize the idea of oppression or totalitarianism as something that really depends on what you mean by development. So what is the government incentivized to do? Are they incentivized to create a lot of free thinkers that are going to agree with some things the government says and disagree with other things that the government says? They are not. Now, are all of the people who work in the public school system, lockstep American government loyalists who, only want to do what the government says? No, but the public school system does create an environment that's primary focus is preserving itself and preserving its own system, its own power structure. So why is it that public school curriculum, which is written by essentially bureaucrats and a mixture of bureaucrats and teachers' unions, why do you think that public school curriculum takes a certain particular slant on politics in almost every case? Well, like you said, the people who write it are politicians, right? And their primary concern is preserving that way of doing business, that structure. Now, I'm not going to go to the extreme of saying that every nation that has a government-run or public school system is primarily focused on control. I think there are a lot of genuine people who work in the public schools that want students who are not just believing a certain thing, but are sort of their creativity is unlocked to explore. That does exist, but it's just the nature of the system. If you have a system whose primary purpose is to preserve itself, then it's not going to be incentivized to create independent learners and creative thinkers.
Purpose is indoctrination, basically. Servants of the state.
I can't disagree.
According to obedience and
So where is that?
I have two questions.
Mm-hmm.
I believe they're connected to each other. You mentioned that students who went through homeschooling or other types of schooling, which is kind of outside the system,
Yep.
that in the US they generally achieve higher scores on different assessments.
Yep.
My first question is, do we know, at least for the US, there are statistics about how educated on average the parents of the children are? And because I just have a hypothesis which may be wrong, I would assume that the parents of those children are generally more educated and have kind of higher educational degrees than the average parent. So is there a causal relationship between going to, those outside the system type of school and those scores? Or could it be that children of parents who have higher IQ, higher EQ, etc., opposed to the normal system, they'll also achieve? I don't know, could be true or not true. I'm just asking if there is any statistics.
So the answer is yes and no. Me and my wife, we both have PhDs. People look at us sometimes and they say, yeah, of course, homeschooling is working great because, you guys already have a high level of education. But it might surprise you to know that the small majority of parents who enroll their children in homeschool or pull their kids out of school don't have college degrees. So they're actually lower educated than the average of parents who put their kids in public school. And one of the reasons for that is because parents with college degrees tend to be more liberal and left to the left. And in the United States, if you're to the left, it's much less likely that you'll homeschool. So in those situations, the children are being taught by essentially, your average, rural family, right? Maybe a blue-collar worker, farmer, and homeschooling is extremely popular in those demographics. So I wouldn't say that necessarily the statistics are because the parents happen to be smart or well-educated. I would say that it's true in many cases. Like there are just so many parents who think to themselves, hey, I've got lots of education and, I'm going to use it. So they homeschool their kids. But that's not, I wouldn't say that's the story. Like me and my wife are not typical homeschool parents, in other words.
What about age? Sorry to interrupt like that. What about age? Does this more mature parent homeschool more? Or
I don't know. What's mature? I'm 31.
Yeah, I don't see.
I'm not mature yet.
Mother and father just deciding out of the blue. Yeah,
it is done. I just don't know the numbers about it, but I have seen it. I mean, my parents, when my brother was born, were 19, and then we started immediately. So that was my experience. I don't know the statistics, but you had a second question. Okay, that was your full question. Okay.
Very good question.
Yes, sir.
Is there a strong correlation between anti-vaxxers and homeschoolers? Is there? Maybe. I don't know. Question.
What I would tell you to do is just Google that in the news, because my organization doesn't have any kind of official position about that, so I'm just going to avoid.
Not as a position, more as statistics and mindset.
Well, what I will tell you is the case is a lot of situations where the school itself requires certain schedule of vaccinations. In those situations, homeschooling is actually the motivation for homeschooling is vaccination. So that is a thing that's happening in New York right now. The numbers just started. Here's the chart of homeschoolers, and then in the last 6 months, it just started going up because there's a new law requiring an additional slate of vaccinations that parents are concerned about. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have this question. Do you see this homeschooling taking massively, like adoption or just parents doing it more? Is that,
Sorry, I missed. What were you asking?
do you see the number from 1.7 million
Yeah.
in the United States, which is a 300 million country?
Yep.
Do you see that number raising exponentially anytime soon?
It is already exponentially increasing. It's the fastest growing form of education in the country.
And what about Europe? Because you're traveling. Good question. Just, we are good
For Europe, my gut feeling is that in some countries, absolutely yes, it's going to be huge, and in other countries, it's never going to happen.
Are we?
And what about Bulgaria?
Like,
What is your gut
Please.
feeling about Bulgaria?
Well,
Honestly.
I'll tell you this. The trends are in countries that used to be part of the Soviet bloc, it's taking off.
Great.
In countries that are EU, Western Europe, Western EU, not. With a couple exceptions. There are exceptions. England has some of the most of any, but that's because they're Anglo. I mean, so United States, England.
There's
Like-
not in the EU anymore.
There won't be any
There's not in the EU anymore.
Yeah.
Anyways.
Yeah.
There's a recent report
Almost.
from a fourth channel just last week about homeschooling and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Can you agree that the homeschooling is freedom of choice how to educate someone or someone choose how to educate?
That's necessary, but not sufficient condition. Yep.
Okay, so clearly we can say that in Bulgaria we don't have legal.
Yeah. Right. So there are levels of freedom, I would say. There's absolute freedom, which would say that there's a government, like a government recognition of like unschool, for example. If there's a government recognition of unschool, you've pretty much arrived. Actually, let's remove that one level. Get rid of the government part. Just unschool everywhere, right? So, but there are also sub-levels of freedom, in my opinion. If the government allows 5 forms of education to flourish instead of 2, that's more freedom. So in my opinion, there are levels.
So law in Bulgaria is tricky stuff.
Yeah.
So state education laws say that it's mandatory to sign up to
With a school, yep.
Yeah, but regarding the constitution, it's not the same.
Correct.
Me and another family here and another, we are doing the real homeschooling.
Meaning there's no registration.
No.
Right.
And basically we are not
Good for you.
government.
I think that's great.
The statistic in Europe, for example, in Bulgaria, we have approximately 1,000 child that are homeschooled. Roughly 500 or 600
That form is a lot more rare than individual, like through the school education, which you said is not homeschool.
In Russia, for example, there is a law that they have a freedom.
Yes.
And
And they encourage it too,
Yeah,
actually.
but-
The government encourages it for a lot of families.
The meaning in the law is they have домашно образование,
Yep.
which means domestic
Domestic education.
education. It's not a homeschool.
It's different from independent homeschool.
Family education.
Yeah.
And Russian is the main out of
I
And roughly there are 15,000 or 16,000 students.
who are independent,
According to their official.
and a lot more in, like you said, домашнее образование.
There's one important detail here. Individual schooling in Bulgaria, where you just take the exams, the kids just take the exams at the end of the semester, that enables this family to homeschool
Correct,
the kid
yeah.
and do the other thing. It's just double effort.
That's my opinion.
Unfortunately, that's
Yeah,
the only thing.
That's my
So I
opinion.
don't
That's why I
understand
count
who's
them
arguing so hard
in the larger
to
number.
talk that it's not
More effort
homeschooling.
and money, basically.
Yeah, sure, but it is a way forward.
It's not a way. It's a
Intermediate solution.
Well, there's division about this topic in the United States as well, because homeschool proponents in the United States, a lot of them are against what we call ESAs, which are government subsidies for homeschooling families. You're already teaching your kids at home. Suddenly there's a law that says, because you're doing this for us and we're not doing it in public school, here's $5,000 every year, which a lot of these families are like, yes, hello. And they change nothing. They change nothing about what they're doing. All the curriculum is the same. They just are, in some cases, mandated, like you said, to take the exams. And in my opinion, like, see, you're very quick to say, oh, well, if any government is involved, that's not homeschooling. But I actually disagree. I think that, like he was saying, you know, there's levels of this, and depending on what the parents choose to do, and depending on how strictly things are enforced, you can still accomplish certain levels of homeschooling, even in a government-run system.
okay. This is a way to escape maybe from the reality in the schools. But basically, when you sign up children here in Bulgaria, the government is receiving the funding from the European Union.
Yeah.
Less money for the government if there are less children in the schools. That's why they
Well,
have
my primary concern is about the type of education the kid is getting, not the money that the government's getting.
So that's why I'm telling that in Bulgaria, officially there is no freedom of education. There is several rebellions like us that we are doing this on purpose and trying to do more. I don't know.
Are we lobbying for a law change? Officially lobbying for a law change. Right?
Yeah.
And that's where I would totally agree. If the law can be changed to such that everyone is doing it that way, I think that would be better. On the other hand, I have to disagree and say that it doesn't mean that the others are not homeschools. That's just we'll agree to disagree on that. Hello.
I know that there is an organization of former homeschoolers in the U.S. who are opposing the government allowing families to choose homeschooling.
Yeah.
And they slander and attack in every possible way homeschooling community.
Oh yeah. More than one.
More than one, yeah.
Yep.
I want to ask a personal question. What did your mother and father do right so that you yourself would not be part of such an organization to start promoting homeschooling and yourself homeschool your daughter?
It's kind of a complex question because you have to understand that there is a dynamic at play with that group and many of the groups like that, where on the surface it's about education and it's about homeschool, but really actually the vast majority of the people who are involved in those kinds of movements are because they've undergone a religious change in their lives. So in the 90s and 2000s, somewhere in the 80th or 90th percentile, and I don't know the exact numbers, but at least 80 to 90% of homeschoolers were doing it for religious reasons, worried about what the schools are teaching and that sort of thing. So if a student grows up and then, as often happens, they decide that they don't want to follow that religion anymore, they kind of associate the educational process with the religious beliefs. So their attacks are not against homeschooling as a system, as a model. Their attacks are against what they were taught in homeschooling. And so then they say things like, well, my parents homeschooled me and they taught me that being gay is not natural, for example, because they're Christians and that's what they taught me. So now I'm an adult and I can think for myself and I know that people are born gay. And so we got to get rid of homeschool because we can't have all these kids learning that people are not born gay. That's what happens. So what did my parents do right? Well, I mean, if you're just like, let's eliminate, so all those religious aspects of that question, let's set those aside, right? There are still people who were homeschooled and hate homeschool because things were done very poorly. So, for example, I would say that there's a significant number of those people, anti-homeschoolers, who were probably abused as kids. And it's just obvious that that problem still would have been a problem if they were in school and then coming home in the evening, right? Obviously still a problem, but in their minds, they are kind of like wanting to lash out at what their parents, how their parents educated them. Other examples could be parents who are very, very poorly educated, and so poorly educated that not only do they not know how to teach the kids, they don't even know how to find someone who can. They don't even know like how to look around for materials that would help the kid educate themselves. So I think there are a lot of unfortunate situations, not by any means even a minority. I mean, it's a negligible number, but they're very vocal now on the internet. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, mostly.
Okay. Other questions?
We have time for two more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think that the regulations in the United States are growing towards the homeschooling?
Regulations are getting tighter.
Yes. Is it getting tough to be homeschooled tougher?
So thankfully, well, yes, they are. The government, by its nature, grows. That's what governments do. That's one of their main roles, honestly. And I say government, I really mean bureaucracy. So
this changed the last 2 or 3 years with Trump. I mean, because he changed many regulations and so on.
So I'll talk about that in a second. But just education, because it's a government department, is always going to be reaching and reaching for more, right? So every state, homeschoolers have to defend themselves in court regularly, routinely. But actually, the trend is with a lot more reaching by the government, there's actually been a lot more rolling back of regulations. So every time they come to court, America's a free country, the regulators lose and the homeschoolers win. They don't always win, but in the last 30 years, there's been by a factor of like 9-to-1 wins to loss ratio. Now about Trump. So Trump has an education secretary. Trump's not directly involved in education. He has a secretary cabinet member, Betsy DeVos. And Betsy DeVos is, in American history, is the highest or the greatest school choice proponent of any education secretary. So that goes for homeschooling as well. So in the last 2 years, yeah, I mean, just in a simple answer, yes. Like Betsy DeVos has been like the foremost champion ever in the Department of Education. One more. Who's it going to be?
Who's going to have the last one? There you go.
So, as homeschoolers, we get pushback from the government, and I can understand that. But what do you think are the reasons that we get a pushback from the general public? Do you think it is just that they are ignorant of the process of homeschooling, or do you think it is a deeper reason regarding our values? And if we want to just have a great time and spend our money on ourselves,
Yeah.
probably we will not spend time with children.
So I don't know enough about values and culture in Bulgaria. I haven't lived here, so I don't think I can answer for America that values are always a question, and we're extremely polarized politically, religiously, socially. So I'm not going to factor out values, but let me just talk aside from that question. Since there are many homeschoolers in America who share 100% the values of most other, your average person, right? Do you drink beer?
Not very often.
Not very often, but we were just having some beers over at a pub, and homeschooling, in my opinion, is a lot like beer. And let me explain what I mean. Why is there pushback? Well, if you and all of your friends are drinking, the most popular brand of beer, what I would call horse piss beer, like Budweiser. Oh, was that a bad word? I don't know. Anyway, everyone's drinking Budweiser or Miller Lite or something, right, at the bar. And everyone sits down. This guy pops open his Miller, Bud, Miller. And you sit down with this like $8 craft beer. Oh, so good, right? Amazing craft beer. Everyone's, and you've got your bottle opener and they're, right? The feeling is, it's the same feeling for someone who does anything like that, right? Anything like homeschooling. Even if it's better, craft beer is obviously better than Miller Lite. Even if it's something that is, not just tastes better, but it's like in a tradition of brewing. It's wonderful. There's all this great stuff about craft beer. But when you're the only one at the table that sits down with craft beer and you're like, oh, I could never drink that horse piss, right? Like, how do you think people are going to react, right? So I think it's natural. Yeah, it's a sense of, like I said before, you know, oh, you think you're cooler than us, right? Like, so I don't see that as like, why is this happening? Where is this coming from? No, I think in anything that we try to do to elevate, right, is going to be that way.
Може да преведем който се цепи от колектива, но го нацепи колективно.
Не е подходящо това.
Okay. We have a similar thought about cooler and being cool.
Vulgarity, but it doesn't matter.
Because when I'm talking with my peers about that we are thinking to homeschool our kids, the most popular answer is, how are you going to deal with just one income? So,
yeah. That's a good question.
And I think you can deal with one income, but just if you get different values.
So with the one income thing, I think you're right, but I also think that it's possible to homeschool and still have two full-time working parents. People don't always fully figure this out, but it's true. You can actually do it. First of all, you have to hope that you have a sort of flexible schedule. First of all. Second of all, you have to appeal to resources outside the parents, private tutors, internet resources, other types of stuff like that. And third, I think, you have to have a certain type of child who doesn't necessarily require 24/7, you know, eyes on. My mom actually had a job, not a full-time job. She had a part-time job that brought in a decent income when I was a kid. And that's because when did I do my schooling? Well, I did it usually between 7 a.m. and 1 p.m. And, you know, then I'm done. And she wasn't really required to be there for most of that anyway. So I think, you know, it's just really, it depends on the situation. There are a lot of situations in which money and having that second income, you don't necessarily have to give that up.
Grandma, sister.
I forgot to mention, of course, extended family. And the reason I forgot to mention that is because, you know, the extended family practice is on the decline in the United States. And my parents live in Washington State, which is like thousands of miles from my house. And my wife's parents live in Chicago, which is, you know, under a little less than 1,000 miles from my house. So it's really difficult for us to spend time with them. But absolutely, that's a primary way. Grandma homeschools the kids while mom and dad work.
I have the question wrestling with what made you leave your United States, which is I believe a better country than Bulgaria and Europe in many respects, including freedom, and come to Europe?
Well, I still live in the United States.
You were living in Europe?
No, I still live in the United States.
Oh, you do? Okay.
The reason why my organization focuses on Europe is because, I don't know if you guys realize this, but there are at least 100 national level organizations who do similar stuff to us in the United States. Why do you think there's 1.7 million homeschoolers, right? Because they have institutional support. So why does Europe have, you know, some countries with like 100? Because people don't even know that it's an option. They don't have anywhere to turn. In America, you see billboards, homeschool your kid. Can you believe that, right? Imagine that.
Yeah.
Okay?
Let's crowdfund it.
I'm putting money into this now.
It exists. And one of the things that I would really like to do eventually as the organization grows is help countries do things like issue campaigns, do things like yearly conferences, all that sort of stuff. And I think that's vital. You have to have a place where people can turn to. And in America, I mean, there's 100 national level organizations. This is going to make you just like your head explode. There's over 300 active homeschool in.
So I can't help you with that at the moment.
There's over 300 active homeschool organizations in Pennsylvania. The state that I live in has over 300 active homeschool organizations. Now, some of them are 10 people, but still, right? 300. And you go to their website and there they are. And you call them up. Hello, homeschool this or that. It's like, that's amazing, right? So I think getting that infrastructure, they don't need me in America, right? They need that here. So thank you guys.
So now we are done. But